Greetings, everyone. My name is Cristina Hernandez Guerrero, and I oversee the public and campus programs at the USC Pacific Asia Museum in Pasadena, California. For a visual description of myself, I'm a woman of Latin descent with tan skin, long, dark hair. I'm currently wearing a bright green dress with lavender-colored flowers on it. I'd like to thank all of you for joining today's conversation at PAM, Belonging, Accessibility, and Advocacy in the Museum. Before we begin our program, I would like to pause for a moment of silence to acknowledge that PAM was built on the sacred land of the Tongva Nation. During this moment of silence, we remember and honor the Tongva and all Indigenous people. Please take a pause to honor these ancestral grounds and to celebrate the resilience and the strength that all Indigenous people show worldwide. And now we are going to hear a few words from Bethany Montagano, the director of the USC Pacific Asia Museum.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I am going to give you guys a doozy of a visual description. My name is Bethany Montagano. I am wearing a red scarf and a black shirt, and I am zooming in from my car because I needed to take my son to a hospital to get a certain test. I can't go back with him because it is COVID. So I am here with you guys, and I guess as a working mom, I just got to wing it sometimes. So here I am. And I just really wanted to say thank you so much to Alice and Amanda for being here. Such an incredibly important program. I hope that you guys are doing this for so many other museums. If there are people tuning in from other museums around LA and around the country, I really, really recommend that you also do this. We have gone through the process at the Pacific Asia Museum of reading Alice's book, Disability Visibility, and it has been a game changer for us and a moment of absolute awakening. And, we're trying to do this at the Pacific Asia Museum as many museums have tried to do, right? We have promised to be better over the last year as we're facing so much criticism that we are part of the problem, right? That we're part of these systems of oppression and that we have collections that represent that, and we want to do things that are more inclusive and accepting and accessible for others. But what does that actually really mean, right? So we're fulfilling on that promise to do better by being, becoming, connecting, and taking action to do better. And that real well-rounded trajectory was very much inspired by the book Disability Visibility, I have to say. If you have not read it, read it. It's an inspired read. And Alice Wong, my hat is off to you for not only executing on this book, but being with us today because of this kind of galvanizing moment that seems to be forming around you to lift up voices and narratives among the disabled community. I am so grateful to you. We realized in reading this book as a staff that accessibility is far more than ADA compliance. It is about making the conscious decisions to hand over our platform and make disabled art and stories a priority, right? To be able to use our platform as a mouthpiece to reach the world. And we want to be able to do things like that. So we're here to learn, we are here to listen, and we are here to, I think, start to have these real conversations at museums. So Amanda, Alice, thank you so much. And Tamara, our interpreter, I really thank you as well. And that's it. So back to you, Christina.
Thank you, Bethany. So for this program, we request that you ask your questions using the Q&A feature below. Alice, Amanda, and I will open up the conversation to questions after they have finished presenting. Now it's my pleasure to finally introduce Alice Wong and Amanda Cachia. Alice is a disabled activist, media maker, and consultant. She is the founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project, a community partnership with StoryCorps, and an online community dedicated to creating, sharing, and amplifying disability media and culture. Alice is also is the editor of a new anthology available now, Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories of the 21st Century by Vintage Books. Amanda is an independent curator and critic from Sydney, Australia. She received her PhD in art history, theory, and criticism from the University of California, San Diego. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary art, curatorial studies and activism, exhibition design and access, decolonizing the museum, and the politics of embodied disability language in visual culture. And now it's my honor to pass this program along to Alice and Amanda. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much, Christina. And I do want to thank also Bethany and Christina for inviting Alice and myself to be with all of you today. It's really an honor and a pleasure for us. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes and share my screen and give a PowerPoint presentation. Before I do that, I just wanted to say that it's an honor to share this space with Alice, whom I admire greatly. Visual description for myself: I am a white, short-statured woman. I'm a brunette with brown eyes. I'm wearing black-rimmed glasses. And today I'm wearing a white sweater with a triangle black outline shape on it. I'm sitting here in my office in San Diego, California, and I have a row of books behind me in my office space here and a window to my left. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay. I wanted to give a bit of a promotion, and so given that Alice has been so wonderful with her book Disability Visibility, I myself am editing a book, and it's going to be the subject of some of the talk today. The book is the title for the new book is called Curating Access, Disability Art Activism and Creative Accommodation. The book is currently under contract with Routledge, and it will come out at the end of 2022. I'm really excited about this book because it's the first time that there will be both curators, artists, other museum professionals contributing and scholars contributing to the writings in the book about the idea of what access means in the museum from a more creative perspective. And Bethany was starting to really hint at that in her kind introduction for us, that the museums need to think beyond just mere legal policies and wheelchair ramps, and what can you actually do to put disability front and center. So we have 30 contributors from around the world in this book, and it will come out, as I said, next year. So I'm really excited about this book. So I will say that, in the time that in this time of COVID, that there has been a seeming increase in disability art and disability curating and disability activism in the museum, which is a really positive thing, obviously. But I'm also kind of curious to see what happens after this pandemic kind of eases up a bit with the vaccination program that's taking place, and what the results will be from thinking more about disability in the museum, if it's long lasting. And Alice and I will have more conversation about that too. But since the time that I've been locked up and in quarantine, I've had lots of people approach me as a disabled curator about my thinking and my thoughts. There was an article that came out last summer by Emily Watlington. Just to give a plug to Emily too, she's a young active writer, critic, and curator who's working on disability issues all the time for Art in America magazine. And she wrote this piece about how to make exhibitions and art events accessible. So I encourage you to explore all of her writing online. And here's some other pieces that I've published about the politics of creative access and just different guidelines for how museums might go about thinking about curating access. This is like my big thing, my big piece. So what do I mean by that? I'll explain more in just a minute. Here's another piece that I had written back in 2013 called Disabling the Museum, and how a curator can really be an activist in the museum in order to engage minority identity subjects and minority audiences. So when we think of accessible exhibition design, I always reference the Smithsonian Guidelines. And so the guidelines talk about wheelchair access, closed captioning, ASL interpreters, Other kinds of like access that are fundamental to the museum, and that's always been really important to my work as a curator. Here are some images that really visualize some of these symbols that we just saw on the previous slide. Also, touch tours, tactile tours. Some of the larger museums in the US are very good at doing all of these things. Braille label, large print labeling, and of course, image descriptions and audio descriptions. That's all incredibly important as well. There's other publications out there apart from just the Smithsonian Guidelines. This is a great one by the artist Carolyn Lazard. It's called Accessibility in the Arts, A Promise and a Practice. And if you go to this website, you can actually download the PDF and follow along with these guidelines. And there's another wonderful one by Shape Arts. Shape Arts are a nonprofit gallery based in London in the UK. And they're also giving us guidelines on how to put on an accessible exhibition. So for me, I'm interested in, all of these guidelines are great, but how can access actually become more of a conceptual tool for interrogation in art exhibitions rather than simply a practical component, simply added in as an afterthought once the exhibition has been installed? So in other words, how can we think of access creatively, or how can we be creative about access, which is the title of my book? And I'm also interested in thinking about all of these components that we are already using in the museum and how to, stretch them and push them and use them. You have artists actually work with these components in their practices and have curators work with them. So clearly Zoom, we're all using Zoom at the moment, but also like screen readers, artist talks, performances, even sign language and panel discussions and multisensorial access. All of these components are important for us to continue to push and consider first and foremost. Here's a series of shows that I've curated over the last 10 years, and I reference them here briefly because the images you're about to see are pulled from all of these exhibitions. And so if anyone's interested, in fact, in looking further into my exhibitions, you can go to my website. And I noticed that Alice kindly put my website in the chat. It's amandacachia.com. So each show that I've curated in the last 10 years has been 100% focused on disability and representations of disability in the arts. And so that to me is like an activist practice, just purely by the fact that I rarely ever saw disability in the museum growing up when I was growing a passion for the arts. And I wanted to kind of rectify that omission and start bringing in disabled artists and representations of disabled bodies in ways that I felt were more generative and less sort of, stereotyped into like these very narrow frameworks. And so from there, I kind of expanded that work to now be a bit of a consultant. Like when I come in as a guest curator into exhibitions, I'm actually kind of giving advice to museums on how they can make their spaces more accessible and how they can work with disabled content in more creative ways. So here's a show that I did where I simply had the artist who I was working with, Carmen Papalia. He had a speaker installation. Carmen is visually impaired, and this installation shows speakers attached to a wall that are of differing heights. So the image on the left gives a great illustration of how people of different heights can actually then put their ears right up against those speakers and access that very easily. So it benefits not only people like myself of short stature, but also children and wheelchair users as well. So it's, I feel like it's, disability access is not just simply necessarily for disabled audiences. It really can be beneficial for everybody. And I think that's an important point that we can talk about later in the Q&A as well. And this is a show that I did that was about representations of dwarfism. And so I actually had the gallery hang everything lower on the wall on purpose. And the gallery was really interested in this display, but I was trying to encourage the director to actually hang everything like this on a more permanent basis. But I think it's really hard for people to make these adjustments where you're actually having a display like this, like permanently, where every artwork is lowered to the lowered on the wall. And so I was thinking about like these adjustments of height in a gallery, and I thought, you know, why can't we become a little bit more, even more radical with the way that we install the art? And so this television screen is on the floor. So whereas average height people actually have to come in and bend and, you know, look to the work that's a little bit more inconveniencing for them. But in fact, a lot of the disabled artists I work with are purposefully doing that. They're purposefully wanting to inconvenience the audience because disabled people feel like every single day of their life they've had to be inconvenienced, that they've had to negotiate barriers because the built environment wasn't made for them or considerate of them. And so it was, you know, the artists that I work with are somewhat aggressive, and, you know, retaliation is like a big part of what they want to do is to like fight back through these kinds of displays that are much harder for average height people to negotiate. I've also been interested in as a curator in basically abandoning the notion of the catalog because I don't think it's accessible. And so instead I've just asked the museums and galleries that I've worked with to develop websites for my exhibitions, and not just any regular website, but also screen reader friendly websites. And I've commissioned a graphic designer and a web designer who identifies as disabled to actually design these for me. And I've built, over the years, I've actually built up a relationship with her so that she can be the expert on this. And you can see in that top right-hand corner where it says show display preferences, that actually you can then make these adjustments to the text, to the color, the contrast, and so on. And it's like a very you know, simple like format for making these adjustments so that the website works for the viewer and the user. And this is another website for another show that I curated in Canada, and it was the same designer that did this one for me. You can see that these setting preferences are much the same. Every time I've curated a show, I've been really fortunate to actually have my exhibitions organized within university galleries, campus galleries, which means that I've gotten to collaborate with other professors, instructors, and students. And so for this exhibition that I did, I actually had the entire, like several classes come in and develop the image descriptions for me, the audio descriptions, which benefit blind folks and visually impaired folks. And so they had recorded all of these descriptions, and they had put them on different types of devices, and people were able to access them from their phones and from the exhibition website. And I think what was really important at this moment for me back in 2012 was to realize that it was important to offer more than one image description per object. And that's because my friend Carmen, whose artwork you saw previously in a previous slide, told me that it was really important to offer options, much like, you know, when you flip through channels on a television, that you want to be able to get a choice of what you're going to watch or listen to. So it became suddenly a really fun, creative exercise. And I then moved, you know, the students were participating in this, but then I decided to ask all my artists in my exhibitions to do it too. So I invited them to record the descriptions, and people could, you know, use their devices and go around the exhibition space and listen to them. And then all of these descriptions were available on the website for people to look at as well. I think I mentioned that. So what's been really interesting and fun for me is that I do this as a professor of art history. I do this with my students all the time now. Because I find that my students really benefit from being able to analyze artwork, you know, for the purposes of their art history writing. And if you just look at this is a really great exercise. If you just look at an image, you'll be able to see that, in fact, you know, if there's 30 people in a room, all 30 people will say something different about a particular image. This is a girl with an ice cream cone. There's like 2 layers of ice cream flavors, a purple, and it looks like maybe a mint flavor, and so on. So people would choose to describe different components of an image very differently, and that kind of proves the point of having those multiple audio description options available for people in the museum. And what I found, this image here is showing like a text of an audio description, is that when I've asked my artists to participate in the audio description exercise, they have often said to me, I've never actually done that before, and I've never thought about how to make my work accessible to other disabilities. So even though they may themselves identify as disabled, they are kind of thinking that they've never actually thought about disability beyond their own particular embodiment, if that makes sense to folks. So I've really enjoyed being able to like collaborate with artists in these exercises. And so the descriptions that I've had have also been available in text-based format and in audio-based format. So that means it's becoming like this layering of translation, going from the visual to the written to the audio and so on. And then we have obviously text-to-speech technology that we've been using as well for our exhibitions. And I encourage students, artists to use different kinds of, there's so much different kinds of software out there that you can use for your recordings. This has been a really easy one that I've encouraged people to use called vocaroo.com. You just go in there and you can create an MP3 file really easily and send it wherever, whatever platform is most appropriate for your exhibition. And obviously, like the old-fashioned CD, DVD is being used in some of the catalogs that I curated in the past. We did develop those so to make sure that all the written was transferred into audio format. This is a great image because it's demonstrating the Braille label on the left, but then on the right is the text, like the label copy. But there's also instructions for how to participate in a particular exhibit. So this was from a show that was really important to me to think about. I thought to myself, I really want everyone to be able to touch everything in this show, because normally when you go and see an exhibition, you can't touch it, which is really unfortunate. So I wanted to turn the tables and have people have a multisensorial experience with art that privileges disabled bodies so that disabled bodies could have more access. So it was ambitious, didn't quite go as I planned, and I'll explain why in a minute. But I asked all the artists to describe the artwork, but also to describe the sounds. So this was an audio piece of a cat purring. And so the artist described the sounds of a cat. And then in this label here, it was actually a scent-based piece. So in this little green vial, it was the smell of grass. And so Brian and Anna said, well, we should describe the smell as well, because what if somebody comes into the gallery and they actually don't have a very acute sense of smell? So I thought that was a brilliant idea, and we did that as well. This is a show that I organized about the experience of sound from a deaf perspective. And what I had done was I was inspired by the Whitney Museum's vlog, and where they have an interpreter going around interpreting all their exhibitions. And I really wanted to do the same thing. And so I had simply my husband go around and record me with an ASL interpreter. And we made this recording available on an iPad at the front desk of the gallery. And then the show ended up actually touring to the University of California, San Diego. And then we had a professional studio there. And we had the ASL interpreter who was interpreting me talking about the work as well. So this is going back to that same exhibit where I said I wanted everyone to touch. So this was the opening, and it was a great success. There was beautiful pieces in the show. This is a gong, but this is literally a series of gongs suspended from the ceiling, and people could use a mallet and children could reach too, which was great. We purposefully hung them lower. And then when you hit those gongs, you had these beautiful sounds that would reverberate across the entire gallery. And that was my favorite work in the exhibit. So here's another detail of people engaging with this work. Here is the piece for the cat purring. So you would touch this wall and you would feel the purring the vibrations of the cat furring underneath that wall. And here's several other pieces in the show. This work here on the bottom right is made from bone china, and visitors could come in and touch all of these pieces. So I was really sort of trying to go full blast on having people touch everything. This was a piece where visitors could come in and actually scratch the surface of the vinyl with their car keys or some other like sharp instrument, and the artist came in and actually did a DJ set with all of those scratched up vinyl records at the end of the show, which was really fun. And this is another collaboration that I had with artists, because Raphael de Groot from Montreal had given me this beautiful video installation of a performance. And I said to her, what can you do with this work to make it three-dimensional, but also much more friendly and accessible to disabled audiences, especially those who are visually impaired or blind? And so we came up with this idea of just putting some of the pieces on this pedestal. These are the materials that were actually used by the artist in her performance in the video. So literally it was like becoming three-dimensional and also incredibly beautiful to touch it. It just brought so much more dimension to her work, and the crinkling of that paper was really pleasurable to listen to as well. And this artist did the same thing. You can see that there is these floating objects in this video installation. It looks fairly abstract. And then Darren actually said he would 3D print the objects that you can see in the video, so that these 3D models were sitting on this platform and people could come and pick them up and touch them and have a tactile experience with what they were looking at on the screen. I really enjoyed doing that. I know I'm probably getting out of time already, Christina, so would you like me to conclude my comments?
Yeah, if you could, I guess, wrap up this slide and we can move on to Alice, please.
Yes, I will do that. So the last image that we're looking at now is where, for this show, I simply had collaborated with the Blind Society of San Diego, and they had made a work together. They collaborated on a piece, and it was all about tactile experiences that they captured on paper, and this is the piece that ended up being in the exhibit. And that was really great as well. But the one thing I'll tell you is that even though my goal was to make this show fully tactile, it didn't go so well because there ended up being a number of damaged objects. And so we were not able, unfortunately, to continue having the exhibition fully accessible through touch. So there's lessons to be learned about that even though you try and be accessible, sometimes things don't always go to plan. And I think it would be fun to talk about that with everybody in our Q&A. Thanks so much for everyone's attention.
Hey everyone, so I'm Alice Wong. Thank you to Bethany and to Christina and everyone at the USC Pacific Asia Museum who helped organize this event. I am just delighted to be in conversation with Amanda. I followed and admired her work from afar for many years, and I feel very thankful to be in community with her. And I personally want to see Amanda curating exhibits and consulting for museums all over the world. So spread the word and do your thing, people. I'm going to speak briefly today about my experiences as a museum lover. And this is an important time when the museums are being held accountable as they should be. And I hope that the work that remains on racism and decolonization also includes thinking about disability as an aesthetic and the belief that access is more than a legal requirement or checklist. I'm also really lucky that when I think back upon my life as a kid and as a disabled child, that my parents took me to museums ever since I was young. My first experience, I think, at a museum was the Children's Museum of Indianapolis. This is where I was born and raised. And later on, as a teenager, clearly, like, I wanted to go to the big city. So for us in Indianapolis, especially as Chinese Americans, we would go to Chicago for a day trip because back then in the 80s and 90s, there really wasn't a lot of like excellent food and culture. So like we would go to Chicago for a day trip. We would load up our groceries, eat some dim sum, and that's where I also started visiting the Art Institute of Chicago and see Bart Chagall's American Windows. Really was like, whoa. And I also got to see a traveling exhibit of the Monet in the 90s. That was like kind of a big deal for me. Like, this is like, something that I really wanted to see, and just to be able to go to it was really cool. About after I graduated from college, I moved to San Francisco. And this is where I've always been ever since. And in San Francisco, I feel so fortunate to be in a pretty small city with a lot of museums. Some of the ones that I, used to visit pre-pandemic. Some of my favorite ones are the SF Moma, the Asian Art Museum, and the Young, and there's just many others. And I think this is something that I've just, benefited from greatly. And, as I said earlier, I love museums. They are spaces that feel special and reverential. And, full confession, I even enjoy the cafes and the gift shops. But I also want them to be more like libraries, another really important public institution, in that they serve the public and are places where communities gather and feel that they belong. And that's the big question, right? Like, how do we, all of us, create an ethos of belonging where access, diversity, and equity are part of this ecosystem, beyond words and beyond tokenistic attempts at change. And one example of how I felt that I belonged was a really fun experience I had in participating in this really giant digital mural by the artist JR. In the chat box, I'm gonna pop in the link from the SF Moma to where the JR digital mural was shown about since 2019 to 2020. He was in San Francisco several years ago, taking photos of residents from every neighborhood. And I went to his studio for a session. A year later, the mural titled The Chronicles of San Francisco opened at the SF Moma, and it took place in a part of the museum that was adjacent to the street level, and that it was free to the public. You did not need to buy a ticket to enter this part of the museum. And I think that was an important aspect, to this idea of belonging and access. I also think another important aspect of this museum was to see myself, along with hundreds of other San Franciscans, in this work of art. And, I never thought in a million years that I would ever be on a wall in a museum. I also think it was meaningful for other disabled visitors to see someone like me in this mural. So for me, belonging in this example meant that It's something that's participatory, that's free and open to all. And I'm gonna screen share this Instagram post very quickly. This is a Instagram post of my friend Sharice Hill, who actually visited the museum, saw the exhibit, and this is her looking at this part of the mural that I'm a part of, and this was along the wall outside of the museum when the exhibit was out. But this really touched me, this Instagram post. She is posing. Sharice is a wheelchair user. She's in front of the black and white mural, and she's putting her hand on the wall right by the image of me. And this was really special. This was, I think this is, shows how the power of representation and why we need so much more of it. So one example of how I felt like I didn't belong was when I tried to get tickets to join Kusama's Infinity Bears when it toured the US in 2018. It was at the Broad in Los Angeles, and I really wanted to go. But here's the thing, for those who may already know or may not know, the exhibit was constructed so that there were 3 rooms where there was a narrow doorway and narrow pathways, so that a wheelchair user may not be able to enter, and they certainly would not be able to turn. So I emailed abroad and I asked, do you have any options or ways that I can experience the exhibit? And they basically said no. And that was an access failure in my mind. And, also, the tickets were snapped up within minutes, so that didn't really help matters anyway. But, I learned later on that at the Hirschhorn, at the Smithsonian, they provided VR, virtual reality headsets, for wheelchair users with the Infinity Bears exhibits that was there in Washington, D.C. And I wish that was available throughout the entire US tour, but that it is what it is. And I think that now with the pandemic, we've seen so many innovative and creative ways that museums have used to create online or virtual exhibits for the public. And this really opens up a museum to a global audience, which again is another layer of access. So before I start asking Amanda some questions and the conversation with her, I want to share just a few other resources. The first thing is another, Amanda mentioned several, disabled artists in her presentation, and there's one person I want to mention in particular, and that's Riva Lair, who is a portrait artist, writer, and activist. She's the author of a new memoir called Golem Girl. And Riva actually did her first ever virtual portraits with me over Google Meets last summer. And here is the result. So I'm going to share this screen share real quick. So this was my summer pandemic project that was completely delightful and just, such an honor. Just like Amanda, Riva is just somebody that I've admired from afar, just kind of eventually kind of got in contact and became friends with her. So this took place over several sessions over Google Meet, and this is the result. And this was a completely challenging and different experience for Riva, who, like many portrait artists, want and need that close contact with their subject. And this is the result. And this is a framed color pencil drawing by Laura Phillip, and it shows me as an Asian American woman with a mask over her nose with a tube attached. And I forgot to describe myself at the beginning, so this is an approximation. And I'm just in my bedroom, and this is what is the result. And I thought that was just super cool to be have a portrait by a disabled artist, two disabled people collaborating. And that is something I really want to see more of. So I'm just going to drop the link real quick. Riva actually wrote a New York Times essay about this experience and about how the pandemic has changed her approach to art. There's another excellent recent interview by Riva. I'm just dropping links left and right, because that's what I do. Here's a link to her book. And I got to interview Riva about our relationship and collaboration, because she really does want an active, dynamic collaboration. Like, I'm not just a subject sitting there. And I've never sat for a portrait before, so I didn't realize how actively I would be part of it. And that was a really just wonderful experience. I also want to just drop this other upcoming thing that might be of interest. There's a group called BAC, which is the Museum, Arts, and Culture Access Consortium. Starting March 2nd of this year, they are having a 4-part series on access practices at cultural institutions. So if anyone wants, is not zoomed out, you might want to check out these seminars, which I think is right up the alley of any museum professional or anybody's interested in museums. And Amanda, I want to thank you for your presentation and all of your work and your scholarship. The one thing that I'd like to ask you is that, first of all, I recently saw a documentary on HBO called Black Art in the Absence of Light that featured a groundbreaking exhibit titled 2 Centuries of Black American Arts, curated by David Driscoll in 1976, which was at the Los Angeles County Museum of Arts. So the film traced how, for decades, Black artists have been sidelined when it comes to museums having exhibits and acquisitions by Black artists. Plus, the lack of opportunities for Black curators. Your presentation highlighted so many amazing artists and disabled curators like yourself out there who are doing great work. And I really believe that disability is not niche, and that our culture needs to be reflected everywhere. What do you think it's going to take for more people like us to be in every part of a museum or cultural institution?
Thanks for your question, Alice, and also thanks for your presentation, which I greatly enjoyed, and all the many links that you were able to put into the chat for us, some of which I wasn't familiar with. So, but to answer your question, you know, the first thing that came to my mind was maybe it will be a global pandemic. Like that, maybe that's what it will take for museums and institutions to actually acknowledge and put us into, you know, into the first and foremost. And so the reason I say that is because literally just an hour before our session together today, I was interviewed by a journalist for the Times who's doing a story on the prevalence of disabled artists and their practices, and how that's suddenly become into the limelight and become of greater interest and greater attention. So he's publishing this article sometime next month, and he was interviewing me about this very question. Alice is like, why is it all of a sudden that now everyone's suddenly interested in this? And I think it's because the world has become crypt because of the pandemic. And so now there's all of this attention towards us and our work and what we're doing and our activism, which I think is really great on the one hand. And I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of my presentation, but on the other hand, it's like, I wonder if it's going to be if there's permanency to this, and if there will be an actual shift that is long lasting. So I guess the answer is I hope so. I mean, I know that I've been asked to give talks around the world at different places, different museums, about how to make their museums accessible. You know, everything from last week, it was Melbourne, Australia. In December, I was giving talks for museums in Russia and in Oslo, Norway. And so it's been great, the attention, and maybe there will be a permanent shift. But I will want to give, like, kind of like what Alice has been doing so thoughtfully, I want to give a push to an organization that I've become really fond of, and I'm going to type them into the chat. They're on Instagram, but they have their own website. It's called the Loot Collective. And I think that like artists themselves are giving themselves their own platforms on social media. On Instagram is a really good one. And if you go to Loot Collective, you'll find like a plethora of amazing artists who are also doing really good work with image descriptions, by the way, I think that they're so sophisticated at doing that work. And there's other museums that are doing really good work too, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Moma. I'll put a few more links in here for the people at these two museums that I really admire their hard work. The Met has Rebecca McGuinness, and Moma has Francesca Rosenberg. So she published quite a big magazine piece last summer with different types of discussions around access in the museum. So, you know, I think it's like, if we keep doing this important work, hopefully, you know, museums will eventually start to shift. I know there's been some worrisome things that have occurred during the pandemic because of budget cuts. And so unfortunately, the education teams that often work with museums and access and artists, their budgets have been cut. So it seems like we're making maybe some progress on the one hand, but then on the other hand, no. So anyway, I'll put one more. Crypt the Met is a hashtag that the Met have been using, which is super interesting and cool. So I'd encourage everyone to look at that too. Yeah. I have a quick question for Alice now, if I can turn to Alice, and then we should probably open up to the Q&A. But Alice, I am going to ask you, I'm going to read off my list here, but what do you propose for greater visibility of disability in museums? Your book is doing, and I have it here too, by the way, your book is doing the important work of shedding more light on the personal narratives of prominent disabled folks. But how can the book translate into an experience visitors in museums can access? And I don't mean like literally your book, but just like the idea of the written word becoming something that people can relate to in a visual sense, or even in a multi-sensorial sense. Creative access, that's the thing that I'm big on.
Yeah, this is a big question. I feel like if I could just, before I respond to that question, I think in response to what you just said about the pandemic, you know, I do feel like a little bit salty that, you know, folks are suddenly realizing that we exist, because, you know, wow, it's such a major global crisis for this to happen, because there have been disabled artists for like centuries and just decades who've always been here, and I just think it's like to get some recognition. It's not even like, super duper like huge recognition. Like that feels still like so overdue, but also like, well, yes, it's great to see it, but also like really, just that to me feels a little bit like, I still feel kind of conflicted about that. Like it's great, but it's also really strange that this is happening. But, and I do also feel hopeful, but also very nervous about this push toward normal, the return of quote unquote normal, and that people would just want to revert back to the ways that they've always done things, because that's more comfortable, and that's what they're used to. So I hope that events like this, conversations like this, really continue. And I don't really know how a work like this could really translate to museums, but I do feel like there could be so many more supplementary materials that museums should also bring, not just some sort of, something that's so leading toward the visual, like as you shared in your presentation. There's so many different ways to tell stories. So I really want that to be kind of on people's minds, people who are curators, people who are in museums, and to also delve back into like, be really open about like if an artist identifies as disabled, to include that kind of background, biography, lived experience as part of the exhibit, so that visitors really have a broader context within which that work is created. So I think that would be my best kind of answer, and I think we'll just transition to the Q&A.
Yeah, I can see that there's quite a few different questions here, which is great. So the first question I have is from Felicia, and it says, for the tactile objects, were they secured to the shelves, or were people able to pick them up freely? Was there a worry of people walking away with things? So the show that I had curated called Sweet Gongs Vibrating, where we did that, was where there was nothing secured to the shelves, people could pick them up freely. I think there was less of a worry of people walking away with things. It was more around if people would damage things. And unfortunately, that is indeed what happened. And even though we kind of assumed that something may happen, it happened a lot worse than we anticipated. And so then we had to sadly make it inaccessible, that people couldn't touch things anymore. So for me, that, this is where I started, and then actually developing a manifesto, which was these guidelines for curating shows where tactility was thought through a little bit more carefully, because we didn't do that the first time round. And even the artists themselves, they all reacted in different ways when they found out that the work was damaged. So it's a kind of a much longer conversation, but thanks for your question, Felicia.
Yeah, I'll just read the second question for Sarah Wong. Hi, Amanda and Alice from Vancouver, Canada. I wanted to ask both of you on your thoughts on how mobile apps, for example, an institution's app or a third-party app, to be used for curators and visitors to better engage with the exhibitions. Is this something both of you like to use? Is it necessary? Or are mobile apps another potential barrier to access? How can mobile apps be better improved or created to increase access in museums? And I think one of the first things I would just respond to is that, a lot of app creators, oftentimes create apps on the fly, or just may not really be accessible for a lot of different kinds of disabled folks. So like, I think any museum or institution that's maybe thinking about their app, or maybe they have an app, is to think about doing an accessibility audit of that app. I would also highly recommend to do an accessibility audit of your website too, because there may be a lot of things. I mean, you may have an excellent web developer, graphic designers, but there are things that disabled people notice that are really experts at in terms of accessibility that can really make your product better. So I think that's the recommendation is if you're planning on this or just already have existing websites or apps to really consult with disabled accessibility experts. And that would be another great kind of way to engage and support disabled experts. What are your thoughts, Amanda?
Yeah, I agree with Alice. I think that's a terrific suggestion. I know that some of the shows that I've curated with various, as an independent curator with various museums, that they've developed different kinds of apps as well for audiences to go through and use image descriptions, although I don't know if they've ever audited those. So that's a really good point, Alice. I do know that the Smithsonian, going back to the Smithsonian Museum, that they've done extensive work with research on apps. So I just actually Googled Smithsonian disability apps and you can find information about what they're doing with apps. They have a free app that people can download to be able to connect to the museum that's supposed to be accessible. So I would recommend going to look at what they're doing because, I mean, this might be a little old news, but, a few years back, they seemed to be at the forefront of this research. So if people like, I can actually put some of these links in. I think that, do we have time for any more questions, Christina? Maybe one more question?
I think we have time for maybe one more question. So anyone in the audience, if you want to ask one more question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A chat box feature.
Yeah, in the meantime, I just put a link to the Center for Accessible Technology, which is an organization led and run by disabled people that actually has a consulting business that tests websites and all kinds of technology. So just if you want to hire disabled folks, that could be a link.
I think we have a question. It's from an anonymous attendee, and I believe it's geared towards Amanda. And it says, if you could create your own exhibition right now, what would it be about?
Oh, this is a great question.
Oh, and Alice, excuse me.
No,
Both of you.
I'll let Amanda answer this because I want to find out.
Oh, wow. Gosh, it would be it would be at least a 50-person exhibition. All of those 50 artists would be disabled, have some kind of relationship with disability that they personally identify in some way. And it would be an exhibition where we're trying to implement all of the tools that I was, talking about in my presentation with creative access. People often ask me actually, like, how can you cater to the needs of everyone? And I always say, well, I can't, but I can certainly try. So working on an exhibition of that scale would take several years of community consultation with my disabled community and, really close discussions and collaborations with the museum that I'm working with to try and present something that's really cutting edge and at the forefront of how to put access first and foremost. I'm getting really excited just fantasizing about this, so maybe it will become a dream one day. But Alice, did you have a response for that too?
Well, I mean, I think I would love to be kind of in partnership with people like you, Amanda, in terms of just having this broader, very, comprehensive look at kind of like the most contemporary, disabled, deaf, neurodivergent artists that are out there who are really doing exciting work. And I think that would be, and I think for me, the activism part is part of the, because I do think that activism is art and art is activism. And I think that would be kind of a theme that, it really would make a hugely exciting kind of exhibit in terms of just the interplay of disabled activists as actual disabled cultural workers. So that would be kind of my dream exhibit. And I would do that also in collaboration with, a lot of people in the community. And I just dropped one more podcast episode. I totally forgot to mention. There was a San Francisco exhibit last year called Cryptech. And I got to interview the two curators. So check out more for that in terms of how they, created a bunch of really kind of focused look at disability, art, and technology.
Well, I think that's the last question we can take today. I know many of you have other questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. I just want to thank Amanda and Alice again. Thank you so much for leading such an insightful conversation. I know that the USC Pacific Asian Museum is excited to move forward with all of your recommendations, and I'm just so thankful that you were able to lead such a great program today. And to our audience members, thank you for attending today's program. It is recorded, so I will be sure to share the recording with you in the next week, and that will be posted on the museum's website. So take care, stay healthy, and I hope to welcome you back at the USC Pacific Asian Museum in person sometime soon. Thanks again.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, Alice. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Caitlin. This concludes our program for today.